How many people were at the Last Supper? If you go by art, say Leonardo da Vinci, who portrays these apostles and Jesus, there are 13 of them, and they're all lined up, of course, on the far side of the table, as if ready for a photograph to be taken. I don't think it was quite like that, but artists seem to portray 13, Jesus and the 12. You'll have other artists who will have them gathered in a circle or around in some way, some sitting on seats, some sitting on the floor, whatever. And the Gospels seem to support this. Often it seems to remark that as the Last Supper is described, Jesus there with the 12. You see, I ask this question because St. Luke tells us in this passage that Cleopas and the person with him is probably his wife, Mary, the wife of Cleopas. Remember the woman who stood at the foot of the cross. It's probably her, but it may be another person. They recognize Jesus at the breaking of bread. Now, St. Luke, writing this gospel passage many years after the time of these events, is probably giving us a message that somehow it's in the Eucharist that these two disciples recognize Jesus, just as you and I are invited to recognize the presence of the Lord at the breaking of bread at Mass in the Eucharist. And indeed, some people will say this whole story is told so carefully by St. Luke to get us to think about how it's so similar to Mass. You see, the first part of the story is about the proclamation of the Scriptures. Jesus explains to them on the road all of the passages that are about him. And it's something about how in the journey of the disciples' life, your and my life, we hear the Scriptures proclaimed as we gather together, and then we move on to the meal together, the breaking of the bread. But you see, for these two people, for Cleopas and his wife perhaps, they weren't at the Last Supper. How do they make the connection between this breaking of bread and the presence of Christ? They've not witnessed those events. Now you could say, oh, well, they were told about it. What in those 2 days? The time of Jesus' crucifixion and the despair, that they're told about the Eucharist. Unlikely, I'd have thought. But you see, there's something else that goes on in the Gospels that seems to connect up with the whole ministry of Jesus. The point is that Jesus regularly sits down with the disciples and eats with them. Not the Eucharist, not the institution of the Eucharist, that's the night before he dies. But the whole point was he sat and had meals with them. After all, he's picked up on this, isn't he? He's told off for doing this, for sitting with sinners and eating with them. And you see, at each of those meals as the leader of the group, like the father in any family, at the beginning of a meal, Jews always began with breaking bread, saying a prayer. And the idea was really that in all of that, not only was there grace before meals, but the one who presided was, in some sense, welcoming and reinforcing the idea that each person there to whom he gave the bread was part of it, sharing in the meal. That's why the people who observe this are scandalized, because Jesus gives these sinners the bread. He makes them welcome. He goes further than that, even when he's at a meal that he's not presiding at. Do you remember the story of the house of Simon, who seems to be a leading figure, if I remember rightly, a Pharisee? And a woman comes in. Now, Jesus will have been given the bread by Simon, who would have presided at the meal. But the woman comes in, and Simon wants the woman to go. But Jesus lets her weep at his feet and wipe away the tears with her hair, and speaks about how she is welcome, that her sins are forgiven. She's part of that gathering. Again and again, there is this idea that at meals, Jesus makes people welcome. And it's no accident. It's no simple repetition of the events of the Last Supper that the first title they give to the Mass, this meal together in these most sacred circumstances, they call it the breaking of bread. We had it in the first reading last week. We're told the disciples remained faithful to the teaching of the apostles, to the prayers, and to the breaking of bread. In other words, this is all about being welcomed, being gathered together. Now, yes, Luke will say, and that's the Eucharist, but it's all about the whole of the church's life, about welcoming people. It's about us gathered today, that Jesus has the bread broken to welcome each one of us. And you know, it's a rule of the church, it has been since the beginning, that at every Mass, the priest must break the bread. He can't not break the bread. He's not allowed to. It happens during the Lamb of God, of course. Now, it's interesting that it's to do with what happened in the Middle Ages, the way they kind of shaped the celebration of the Eucharist. But there are many priests who, because of the way they were trained, I suppose, and just the pattern in which they became accustomed, they'll break the bread at the Lamb of God, and then they put the two halves back together again and hold it up as if it's still a single host and say, "Behold the Lamb of God." The whole point really is, he's supposed to show you the broken bread, because it's to remind us that there are all these other pieces that are going to be shared out. Now, of course, from a practical point of view, we can't do it that we have one single piece of bread. It would just take too long to divide it among ourselves. But the church says there must at least be the gesture to remind us, so that we'll never forget that this is shared among us, that we're all welcome. The breaking of bread is about belonging. Now, you know as well as I do, there are people here who, for various reasons, won't receive Holy Communion. For some, it's because they're still preparing. For some, it's because they've not made their first communion in the Catholic Church. For others, there are other reasons, all kinds of reasons, and, you know, that's fair enough. But the whole point is, this gesture, this breaking, is about us all being together, every single one of us, that we all belong together. Jesus shows himself, reveals himself in his welcome. And Jesus invites us to dine with him.